In many respects, the Bible represents or expresses a basic discontent with the larger cultural milieu in which it was produced. And that's interesting for us because a lot of modern people have a tendency to think of the Bible as an emblem of conservatism, right? We tend to think of this as an old fuddy-duddy document. It's outdated, has outdated ideas. And I think the challenge of this course is that you read the Bible with fresh eyes so that you can appreciate it for what it was, and in many ways what it continues to be, a revolutionary cultural critique. We can read the Bible with fresh and appreciative eyes only if we first acknowledge and set aside some of our presuppositions about the Bible. It's really impossible, in fact, that you not have some opinions about this work because it's an intimate part of our culture. So even if you've never opened it or read it yourselves, I bet you can cite me a line or two, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and I bet you don't really know what it means. The poor will always be with you. I'm sure you don't really know what that means. These are things and phrases that we hear, and they create within us a certain impression of the biblical text and how it functions. Verses are quoted, they're alluded to, whether to be championed and valorized or whether to be lampooned and pilloried, but we can feel that we have a rough idea of the Bible and a rough idea of its outlook, when in fact what we really have are popular misconceptions that come from the way in which the Bible's been used or misused. Most of our cherished presuppositions about the Bible are based on astonishing claims that others have made on behalf of the Bible, claims that the Bible has not made on behalf of itself. So before we proceed, I need to ask you to set aside, for the purposes of this course, some of the more common myths about the Bible. I have a little list here for you. The first is the idea that the Bible's a book. It's not a book. We'll get rid of that one. Okay, the Bible is not a book. With all that that implies, that it has a uniform style and a message and a single author, the sorts of things we think of when we think in a conventional sense of the word book. It's a library, right? It's an anthology of writings or books written and edited over an extensive period of time by people in very different situations, responding to very different issues and stimuli, some political, some historical, some philosophical, some religious, some moral. There are many types or genres of material in the Bible. There's narratives, wonderful narrative stories. There's all kinds of law. There are cultic and ritual texts that prescribe how some ceremony is supposed to be performed. There are records of the messages of prophets. There's lyric poetry. There's love poetry. There are proverbs. There are psalms of thanksgiving and lament. So there's a tremendous variety of material in this library. And it follows from the fact that it's not a book, but an anthology of diverse works, that it's not an ideological monolith. And this is something a lot of students struggle with. Each book or strand of tradition within a book, within the biblical collection, sounds its own distinctive note in the symphony of reflection that is the Bible. Genesis is concerned to account for the origin of things and wrestles with the existence of evil, the existence of idolatry, and suffering in a world that's created by a good God. The priestly texts in Leviticus and Numbers emphasize the sanctity of all life and the ideal of holiness and ethical and ritual purity. There are odes to human reason and learning and endeavor in the wisdom book of Proverbs. Ecclesiastes reads like an existentialist writing from the 20th century. It scoffs at the vanity of all things, including wisdom, and espouses a kind of positive existentialism. The Psalms are very individual writings that focus on individual piety and love and worship of God. Job, possibly the greatest book of the Bible, I won't give away my preferences there, challenges conventional religious piety and arrives at the bittersweet conclusion that there is no justice in this world or any other, but that nonetheless we're not excused from the thankless and perhaps ultimately meaningless task of righteous living. One of the most wonderful and fortuitous facts of history is that later Jewish communities chose to put all this stuff in this collection we call the Bible. They chose to include all of these dissonant voices together. They didn't strive to reconcile the conflicts, nor did we. nor should we, excuse me, nor should we. They didn't, we shouldn't. Each book, each writer, each voice reflects another thread in the rich tapestry of human experience, human response to life and its puzzles, human reflection on the sublime and the depraved. And that leads me to my second point, which is that biblical narratives are not pious parables about saints. Okay? Not pious tales. They're psychologically real literature about very real and realistic people and life situations. They're not stories about pious people whose actions are always exemplary and whose lives should be models for our own, despite what Sunday school curricula will often turn them into, right? And despite what they would have us believe. There is a genre of literature that details the lives of saints, hagiography, but that came later and is largely something we find in the Christian era. It's not found in the Bible. The Bible abounds with human, not superhuman beings, and their behavior can be scandalous. It can be violent, it can be rebellious, outrageous, lewd, vicious, but at the same time, like real people, they can turn around and act in a way that is loyal and true, above and beyond the call of duty. They can change, they can grow. But it's interesting to me that there are many people who, when they open the Bible for the first time, they close it in shock and disgust. Jacob is a deceiver. Joseph is an arrogant, spoiled brat. Judah reneges on his obligations to his daughter-in-law and goes off and sleeps with a prostitute. Who are these people? Why are they in the Bible? And the shock comes from the expectation that the heroes of the Bible are somehow being held up as perfect people. That's just not a claim that's made by the Bible itself. So biblical characters are real people with real, compelling moral conflicts and ambitions and desires, and they can act short-sightedly and selfishly, but they can also, like real people, learn and grow and change. And if we work too hard and too quickly to vindicate biblical characters just because they're in the Bible, then we miss all the good stuff. We miss all of the moral sophistication, the deep psychological insights that have made these stories of such timeless interest. So read it like you would read any good book with a really good author who knows how to make some really interesting characters. Thirdly, the Bible's not for children. I have a 12-year-old and 8-year-old. I won't let him read it. I won't let it read it. Those Bible stories for children books, they scare me. They really scare me. It's not suitable for children. The subject matter in the Bible is very adult, particularly the narrative texts. There are episodes of treachery and incest and murder and rape, and the Bible is not for naive optimists. It's hard-hitting stuff, and it speaks to those who are courageous enough to acknowledge that life is rife with pain and conflict, just as it's filled with compassion and joy. It's not for children in another sense. Like any literary masterpiece, the Bible is characterized by a sophistication of structure and style and an artistry of theme and metaphor. And believe me, that's lost on adult readers quite often. It makes its readers work. The Bible doesn't moralize, or rarely moralizes. It explores moral issues and situations, puts people in moral issues and situations. The conclusions have to be drawn by the reader. There are also all kinds of paradoxes and subtle puns and ironies. And in section where you'll be doing a lot of your close reading work, those are some of the things that will be drawn to your attention. You'll really begin to appreciate them in time. The fourth myth we want to get rid of. The Bible is not a book of theology. It's not a catechism or a book of systematic theology. It's not a manual of religion. Despite the fact that at a much later time, very complex systems of theology are going to be spun from particular interpretations of biblical passages. You know, there's nothing in the Bible that really corresponds to prevailing modern Western notions of religion, what we call religion. And indeed, there's no word for religion in the language of biblical Hebrew. There just isn't a word religion. With the rise of Christianity, Western religion came to be defined, to a large degree, by the confession of or the intellectual assent to certain doctrinal points of belief. Religion became defined primarily as a set of beliefs, a catechism of beliefs or truths that required your assent, what I think of as the catechism kind of notion of religion. That's entirely alien to the world of the Bible. It's clear that in biblical times and in the ancient Near East generally, religion wasn't a set of doctrines that you ascribed to. Right? To become an Israelite, later on a Jew, the word Jew isn't something we can really historically use until about this time. So most of our period we're going to be talking about the ancient Israelites. I would point out, well, I don't really need to cross this out. This is something to discuss. I would point out that the Bible was formulated and assembled and edited and modified and censored and transmitted, first orally and then in writing, by human beings. The Bible itself doesn't claim to have been written by God. That belief is a religious doctrine of a much later age, and even then one wonders how literally it was meant. It's interesting to go back and look at some of the earliest claims about the origin of the biblical text. Similarly, the so-called 5 books of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the first 5 books we call the Pentateuch of Moses, nowhere claim to have been written in their entirety by Moses. That's not something they say themselves. Some laws in Exodus, the Book of the Covenant, a few things, yes, it says Moses wrote those down, but not the whole 5 books that traditions later will ascribe to him. The Bible clearly had many contributors over many centuries, and the individual styles and concerns of those writers, their political and religious motivations, betray themselves frequently. I leave aside here the question of divine inspiration, which is an article of faith in many biblical religions. It's no doubt an article of faith for people in this very room. But there is no basic incompatibility between believing on faith in the divine inspiration of the Bible and acknowledging the role that human beings have played in the actual formulation and editing and transmission and preservation of that same Bible. And since this is a university course and not perhaps a theological course or within a theological setting, it's really only the latter, the demonstrably human component, that will concern us. It's very easy for me to assert that our interest in the Hebrew Bible will be centered on the culture and the history and the literature and the religious thought of ancient Israel in all of its diversity, rather than questions of faith and theology. But the fact remains that the document is the basis for the religious faith of many millions of people, and some of them are here now. It is inevitable that you will bring what you learn in this course into dialogue with your own personal religious beliefs. And for some of you, I hope all of you, that will be enriching and exciting. For some of you, it may be difficult. I know that. And I want you to rest assured that no one in this course wishes to undermine or malign religious faith any more than they wish to promote or proselytize for religious faith. Religious faith simply isn't the topic of this course. The rich history and literature and religious thought of ancient Israel as preserved for us over millennia in the pages of this remarkable volume, that is our topic. And so our approach is going to be necessarily academic. And especially given the diversity of people in this room, that's really all that it can be, so that we have common ground and common goals for our discussions. But it has been my experience that from time to time, students will raise a question or ask a question that is prompted by a commitment, a prior commitment to an article of faith. Sometimes they're not even aware that that's what they're doing. And I want you to understand that on those occasions, I'll most likely respond by inviting you to consider the article of faith that lies behind that question and is creating that particular problem for you. I'm not going to be drawn into a philosophical or theological debate over the merits of that belief, but I'll simply point out how or why that belief might be making it difficult for you to read or accept what the text is actually and not ideally saying, and leave you to think about that. And I see those as wonderful learning opportunities for the class. Those are in no way a problem for me. All right, so let's give a few sort of necessary facts and figures now about the Bible, and then I need to talk a little bit about the organization of the course. So those are the last two things we really need to do. an overview of the structure of the Bible. So you have a couple of handouts that should help you here. So the Bible is this assemblage of books and writings dating from approximately 1000 BCE. We're going to hear very diverse opinions about how far back this stuff dates, down to the 2nd century. The last book within the Hebrew Bible was written in the 160s BCE. Some of these books, which we think are roughly from a certain date, they will contain narrative snippets or legal materials or traditions, oral traditions that may even date back or stretch back further in time. And they were perhaps transmitted orally and then ended up in these written forms. The Bible is written largely in Hebrew, hence the name Hebrew Bible. There are a few passages in Aramaic. So you have a handout that breaks down the 3 major components. It's the one that's written 2 columns per page. Okay? We're going to talk in a minute about those 3 sections, so you want to have that handy. These writings have had a profound and lasting impact on 3 world religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. For the Jewish communities who first compiled these writings in the pre-Christian era, the Bible was perhaps first and foremost a record of God's eternal covenant with the Jewish people. So Jews refer to the Bible as the Tanakh. It's the term you see up here. That should be also on that sheet. Tanakh, which is really the letters T, N, and Ch. And they put little A's in there to make it easy to pronounce, because it's hard to pronounce. So Tanakh, okay? And this is an acronym. The T stands for Torah, which is a word that means instruction or teaching. It's often translated law. I think that's a very poor translation. It means instruction, way, teaching. And that refers to the first 5 books that you see listed here, Genesis through Deuteronomy. The second division of the Bible is referred to as Nevi'im, which is the Hebrew word for prophets. The section of the prophets is divided really into 2 parts because there are 2 types of writing in the prophetic section of the Bible. The first, or former prophets, continues the kind of narrative prose account of the history of Israel, focusing on the activities of Israel's prophets. All right? So the former prophets are narrative texts. The latter prophets are poetic and oracular writings that bear the name of the prophet to whom the writings are ascribed. You have the 3 major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, and then the 12 minor prophets, which in the Hebrew Bible get counted together as one book, because a lot of those 12 are very small. Okay? The final section of the Bible is referred to as Ketuvim in Hebrew, which simply means writings, and that's probably about 50% of the Hebrew you're going to get in the whole course. So please don't be scared. I've got 2 or 3 other terms that'll be useful along the way, but there's really no need to know Hebrew. I just want you to understand why Tanakh is the word that's used to refer to the Bible. So the Ketuvim, or the writings, are really a miscellany. They contain works of various types. And the 3 parts correspond very roughly to the process of canonization or authoritativeness for the community. The Torah probably reached a fixed and authoritative status first, then the books of the prophets, and finally the writings. And probably by the end of the 1st century, all of this was organized in some way. If you look at the other handout, you'll see, however, any course on the Bible is going to run immediately into the problem of defining the object of study, because different Bibles served different communities over the centuries. One of the earliest translations of the Hebrew Bible was a translation into Greek known as the Septuagint. It was written for the benefit, it was translated for the benefit of Jews who lived in Alexandria, Greek-speaking Jews who lived in Alexandria, Egypt in the Hellenistic period before, somewhere around the 3rd or 2nd century BCE. The translation has some divergences with the traditional Hebrew text of the Bible as we now have it, including the order of the books. And some of these things are charted for you on the chart that I've handed out. The Septuagint's rationale for ordering the books is temporal. They've clustered books, Genesis through Esther, which tell of things past. The books of Job through the Song of Songs or the Song of Solomon contain wisdom that applies to the present, and then the prophetic books, Isaiah to Malachi, contain or tell of things future. Some copies of the Septuagint contain some books not included in the Hebrew canon but accepted in the early Christian canon. The Septuagint, the Greek translation, became by and large the Bible of Christianity, or more precisely, it became the Old Testament of the Hebrew Bible. The church adopted the Hebrew Bible as a precursor to its largely Hellenistic Gospels. It was an important association for it with an old and respected tradition. Our primary concern is the Bible of the ancient Israelite and Jewish community, the 24 books grouped in the Torah, prophets, and writing on that other sheet, which is common to all Bibles, right? Whether Jewish or Christian, those 24 are the baseline common books. So those are the 24 that we're going to focus on. Because the term Old Testament is a theologically loaded term, it sort of suggests the doctrine that the New Testament has somehow fulfilled or surpassed or antiquated the Bible of ancient Israel. You're going to hear me refer to the object of our study as the Hebrew Bible. You may certainly use any other term, and you may certainly use the term Old Testament, as long as it's clear we're talking about this set of 24 books, and not some of the other things that are in the Old Testament that aren't in the traditional Hebrew Bible. It means you're studying less, so that might be a good thing. So it's fine with me if you want to use that, but I will prefer the more accurate term Hebrew Bible. Also, while we're on terminology, you'll notice that I use BCE to refer to the period before 0, and CE to refer to the period after 0, the Common Era, and before the Common Era. And in a lot of your secondary readings and writings, they'll be using the same thing. It corresponds to what you know as BC, before Christ, and Anno Domini, right, AD, the year of our Lord. It's just a non-Christian centric way of dating, and a lot of your secondary readings you'll see it, so you should get used to it. BCE and CE, before the Common Era and the Common Era. From earliest times, Christians made use of the Bible, but not always in Greek translation. And the Christian Old Testament contains some material not in the Hebrew Bible, as I've mentioned. And some of these works are referred to as the Apocrypha, so you will have heard that term. These are writings that were composed somewhere around here, sort of 200 BCE to 100 CE. They were widely used by Jews of the period. They simply weren't considered to be of the same status of the 24 books. I'm glad they pick up the garbage at 11:10 on Wednesday mornings. But they did become part of the canon of Catholic Christianity, and in the 16th century their canonical status was confirmed for the Catholic Church. With the Renaissance and the Reformation, some Christians became interested in Hebrew versions of the Bible. They wanted to look at the Hebrew and not the Greek translation from the Hebrew. The Protestant Church denied canonical status to the books of the Apocrypha. They said they were important for pious instruction, but excluded them from their canon. There are also some works you may know of referred to as the pseudepigrapha. We'll talk about some of these things in a little more detail later. From roughly the same period, tend to be a little more apocalyptic in nature. And they were never part of the Jewish or the Catholic canon. But there are some Eastern Christian groups that have accepted them in their canon. The point I'm trying to make is that there are very many sacred canons out there that are cherished by very many religious communities, and they're all designated Bibles. So again, we're focusing on that core set of 24 books that are common to all Bibles everywhere, the 24 books of what would in fact be the Jewish Tanakh. Not only has there been variety regarding the scope of the biblical canon in different communities, but there's been some fluidity in the actual text itself. We don't, of course, have any original copies of these materials as they came off the pen of whoever it was who was writing them. And in fact, before the middle of the 20th century, our oldest manuscripts, fragments and manuscripts of the Bible dated to the year 900. That's an awful long distance, right, from the events they're talking about. And you got to think about that, right? You got to think about that and what it means and how were they transmitted and preserved without the means of technology, obviously, that we have today. And what was so exciting in the middle of the 20th century was the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. I'm sure that you've heard of them. They brought about a dramatic change in the state of our knowledge of the Hebrew our Hebrew manuscript evidence. The Dead Sea Scrolls were found in caves in the Judean desert. We used to think they were a library of a sectarian community. Now I think they think it was a pottery factory or something. So maybe they were just shoved there by people fleeing the Roman conquest in 70. So that's up for grabs. But we have this really great collection of scrolls. And among them, we have found an almost complete copy of every book of the Bible. Almost complete copy of the book of Isaiah, and then partial or copies or fragments of all of the biblical books, except maybe Esther. Am I wrong about that? I don't think there's an Esther from Qumran. I think that's the only one. And some of them date back to the 4th and 3rd century. So do you understand now why everybody was so excited? Suddenly, we have evidence 13 or 1400 years earlier that people were reading this stuff, and you know, by and large, it's a pretty constant textual tradition. Sure, there are differences. Sure, there are differences. We see that our manuscripts are not exactly like those fragments, but there is a remarkable degree, a high degree of correspondence, so that we really can speak of a relatively stable textual tradition, but still some fluidity. And that's going to be interesting for us to think about.